chapter 11. This is what I went back to in reminding myself of Paul's zeal. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Start reading in verse... Let me see, what do I want to start reading? Let's start reading in verse 22. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant. In stripes above measure. In prisons more frequently. In deaths often. Now that's a trick none of us have accomplished yet. Even though some of us felt like we were going to die if we had to stick stuff up on the walls one more time. I know Rick felt that way of just having to go up a ladder to try to hang stuff. It's like, I'm going to die before this is all over with. He had that look on his face yesterday afternoon. But yet he kept going.
I think that we need to stop a second and thank John for the water cleanup.
Yeah. We'll get there. We'll get there, Melody. Hang in there. Where was I before we talked about the flooding? Thank you. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. Now you understand the reason it was minus 1. The law said they could do 40. But if they miscounted and did 41, the guy doing the whipping then had to get 40 stripes. So they always held back one in case somebody miscounted. So Paul's saying 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Now these weren't just something little skinny. These were big honking rods that could break bones. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep. Now, I have to say, Robin and I have experienced being out in the ocean and our sailboat capsizing. Now, we weren't in distress like Paul because there were other boats around us, but it's a really strange feeling when your boat goes over and you're out in this water and everything you have in your boat is drifting off. And you're looking, trying to swim, and you're thinking, man, that's a long way to swim back to shore. I'm not sure I can make that. And you know that there are sharks in this water, there are barracudas in this water, there are jellyfish in this water. Of course, if you ask Robin this story, she'll tell you the only thing I was worried about was losing my hat. But Paul's saying, I've been a night and a day, I have been in the deep. It's hard to tread water that long, folks. It is hard to tread water that long. Verse 26, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils my own countrymen, in perils of Gentiles. Now let me back up. My own countrymen. Everywhere that Paul went to establish church or teach, his own people plotted to have him put in prison or kill him because they did not want him speaking the truth of God's word. So he's saying, my own people, perhaps some of his own family members. I know many from the tribe of Benjamin, people perhaps that he grew up with, were plotting to get him imprisoned, to have him beaten, to have him killed. Tell me that that's not a reason to give up. Kind of makes the murals falling off the wall petty, doesn't it, Stacia? Stacia, cool, calm, and collected, comes in here yesterday. She just looks at them and holds them up and sorts them, and then, you know, VBS, guys, is when you got to make up your mind you're going to get orders from the women. That's all there is to it. So Stacia's telling Gary, that one goes over there, this one goes here. Jenny is saying, no, this fish goes up. Now up a little more, Rick, up a little more. But what I want you to hear from this is not the women giving orders, because that's okay. It's the challenge of being a servant. I want you to hear me on this. Being a servant of God is not going to be easy in any shape or form. But Paul remained faithful. He not only remained faithful, he remained enthusiastic. Now flip back to Romans chapter 1. In looking at this, I had to ask myself, okay, how did he stay faithful? When we're going through a week of teaching kids, when we're facing the challenges of Rick and Charlie back in the kitchen doing their creations for snack time, when we're faced with the challenges of perhaps a child that doesn't want to be here, but their parents want them to be here. How do we face this? How do we deal with the discouragement, the worn out, the frustration? Let's face it, there are a few of us that are not youngsters anymore. We may think we are, but we don't feel that way all the time. The challenges are great and many. So as I kept reading this passage, I ran across verse 9. And Paul writes and he says, "For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit." And I would underline, serve with my spirit. Because I believe that is the key to how he stayed enthusiastic and faithful with all that he went to. He served wholeheartedly. He served with every fiber of his being. Now, all of us, every person that's in a church, serves God based on how they were raised. Some serve out of fear that God's going to punish them if they don't serve. Some serve out of traditional commitment. Some serve out of a heritage commitment that, well, I grew up in this church, my mother served in this church, my dad served in this church, so I'm going to serve in this church. Others serve because they want the pats on the back. Others serve just to be recognized, to be with the movers and shakers within churches. All of us have influences in our lives that affect how we serve God. Every one of us do. Paul was raised in the church. He was a tribe of Benjamin. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He knew the higher ups. He rubbed shoulders with them. He was today, in today's terms, he was a mover and shaker. But how did Paul overcome all of that? Because let me tell you something, that does not hold up when you're getting whipped, when you're being shipwrecked, when you're being beaten with rods. When you throw your hands up and say, that's it, I don't know why I'm doing this anymore. And adults, I want you to listen to me on this. Do not ever question why you do it or determine what you do in serving God based on the outcome that you see. Don't ever do it. Because you see, we sow seed. It is God that produces the harvest. We don't know what God's going to do with the seeds that we sow with the kids that are coming in. We have no idea. And Paul had no idea with what he was doing ministry-wise. He had no idea what was going to come of it. But there's some things that I identified that he was able to do to overcome the influence of his heritage and overcome where he was at. The first one is this. We need to understand the God that we serve. The Greek word for serve, liturgia, is also frequently translated worship. Do you know that as you serve God, for many of you in VBS, that you are worshiping God? So my question for you is, how are you serving? How are you worshiping God? When John was helping yesterday, mopping up water. See, Melody, I told you I'd get to it. She's still issuing orders. I'll work on that. When he was mopping up water, you know, it wasn't a matter of having to issue orders or stand there and make John do it. It was a willing heart to serve. And I'll bet at the time, John did not give it a thought that that was a form of worship and what he was doing. He just wanted to serve. But you see, the thing we need to understand is this is the greatest form of worship that we can present to God, is in how we serve Him to the generations coming up. It is the greatest form of worship. Something that is lacking in our churches today. Because service in our churches today is all about outcome. It's all about what we see happen. Well, I did 500 lunches this week. Well, we served 89 kids this week. We served 30 kids at lunches. And Charlie, where you at, Charlie? Wave your hand at me. I owe you an apology. I violated one of my rules at council meeting, and I'm going to make a public apology to that now. I shared a number of kids of what we were serving rather than sharing the opportunity of how we were serving. And that's wrong. It isn't about the numbers, folks. It is about how we serve God and the message that we share to each individual that we serve. It is the significance of the individuals, not the numbers of the groups. You hear me on that? I believe this is what Paul knew. And Paul identified his worship or his service as worship. And again, the greatest worship any of us can give to God is in how we serve Him in the things that we do. We need to be prepared to serve Him from the very depth of our heart. That's what Paul's saying when he's talking about our spirit. That he is serving from the very depth of his heart with a level of intimacy with God. It's not about how many kids we have. It is about the message that we deliver to them. So, Paul knew that it was about worship. He realized that. But then, how are we supposed to do this? Paul shared about this in Romans chapter 12. So turn to Romans 12 for me. First two verses of Romans 12. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present yourself a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Now there's some things here that Paul talks about. First thing is, he says, present your body a living sacrifice. He literally is saying, ever willing. Now I think Paul is evidence of that. I believe Paul is evidence of being ever willing, because I don't know of any of us in this building that we would go through a stoning and come back for more. That we would experience a beating and come back for more. I can't say that I would do that. I'd like to think that I would, but I can't say it. My goodness, there are times that I just have a bad week within a church, and I've wanted to throw my hands up and give up. Shame on me. Paul is saying the key is to be an ever willing servant, a living sacrifice. The other thing that it means is we got to get over ourselves and give up our personal conveniences and wants. Every day, if we're going to be effective in serving God in this community, out of this church, we got to get over ourselves. Not only get over ourselves, but we've got to give up our own plans, our own agendas. And when I say give up our own plans and our own agendas, that means giving up how we think things ought to go. Rick and I put this staging together. And I downloaded the picture of how the staging was supposed to go together, and Rick and I worked on it, started putting it together, and Rick had gone to go pick up hay or something, and I'm sitting here by myself, and I'm looking at the picture, and I realized Bay Cafe was supposed to go over here, and the door was supposed to go over here. Now, Stacia's grinning at me. She knows what's coming next. The type A personality in me wanted so bad to dismantle that and move it around the way it was supposed to be. But if I'd not told you that, probably none of you but Stacia would have known that it was that way. Because it didn't matter. It just didn't matter. What matters is the heart in which we serve to share the truth of the gospel with the kids. It is all about them understanding who God is. It is all about them understanding the God that they can trust and rely on. My God, we've had Cade up here, a month ago when he recited John 1? Cade's how old now, Stacia? 7. just rattled it off. He may not grasp it all, but his heart is sincere in knowing it. And the rest will come. Just like a seed, when it is put in the ground, it is not producing the fruit that is expected from the seed until it matures and grows. We're seed planters, folks. And Paul said, be ever willing. And he went on in verse 2 and he said, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, change your thinking. Undo your thinking. Get over yourself and your thinking. And go back to what God says. Do it God's way. What's more important? Speak the truth, speak it in love. I couldn't find anywhere in the Bible that God said that Bay Cafe needed to be over here and this door needed to be over here. I couldn't find that anywhere. I couldn't find where we couldn't put a screen up there in front. Of course, if we had not put a screen up there in front, we'd have had a real problem. Stacy's checking her dioramas now. They're fine. They're all up on the wall. Praise God, they're all up. That was exciting. I have to confess, that's the first thing I looked at when I came in this morning. But Paul is saying to us all, if we're going to be effective in serving, to get over ourselves, get over our thinking, and be ever willing to serve God. Folks, it's not about us. It's about the significance of others that need to know the truth. That's what it's all about. But he went on, when it talks about surrendering yourself, flip over to Galatians. Galatians chapter 2. And verse 20. I got to confess, this verse perplexed me for years. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul basically gives an enormous testimony within this verse. He surrendered himself to Christ. In other words, his old way of thinking and his old life is over. He gave it up. He worked very hard at giving it up. How many of us work every day to give up our old life and our old way of thinking in order to serve God? How many of us work hard at giving up our old attitudes, our old way of doing things, our old stressing and fretting, so we can love on the kids that are going to be coming this week, and giving them the truth of the gospel that can matter for them for all of an eternity. Let me tell you something. It is not about whether we hold a title or a number of how many kids accepted Jesus. It isn't about that. Because that piece of paper that we fill out that they accepted Jesus, that ain't going to hold up in eternity anyway. It is about the message of the truth that we give them and what difference that makes in all of eternity. And the only way to really stop the generations coming up from destroying themselves is by teaching them the truth, and that alone. That's the only way it can happen. And you really know the reason that it doesn't happen up to now is because our generation can't get over themselves. We can't get over ourselves. We've got to have the music just right. We've got to have the projection just right. The preacher's got to preach just right. We've got to have just the right number of people coming. And if the right number of people are not coming, then something's wrong and we've got to change things. Let me tell you something. The preacher does not draw them in. God does. One thing I am convinced of is this. God's not going to draw them in if our hearts aren't right. If we are not ever willing to serve. The second thing that Paul says about in Galatians 2:20 is this. I live by faith. In 2 Corinthians 5:7, Paul told the church at Corinth, he says, for we walk by faith and not by sight. In other words, we live by faith. We live by the faith of the Son of God. Living by faith is what binds us to Christ because we live a life that is determined on the truth of Jesus Christ and the precepts of God's Word, and not on ourselves. There is a tangible, physical connection that takes place. And that connection takes place in how we live out the truth of God. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Many of you probably could quote that. I'm curious whether Cade could quote it. But it's trust in the Lord with all your heart. And what? Lean not in what? Your own understanding. Get over yourself. In all your ways what? Acknowledge Him. Who? Who's the Him? God. And He will direct your path. Some translations say He will make your path straight. In other words, you won't have to wander over here and wander over here and go over here to try to figure out what to do in your life. God makes it straight because God knows where He's going. God knows where He's going with these kids that are going to be here. And you know what? God knows where He's going with you as a result of these kids coming. We have no idea the work that God will do in our hearts as a result of working with these kids. My mother worked with kids for 28 years at Calvary Baptist, superintendent of the junior department.